1995, so long time. And I do have a Part 141 school, so FAA approved, lots of extra rules, lots of extra paperwork. And in theory, we can do it in less time than you can from Part 61, but it says you can do it instead of 10 hours in 8 for a private. Nobody gets done in 10 hours anyway, so it's kind of a moot point. But I do have a 141 school, one of only 5 in the country, and of course it's the best one. So, as Don said, this fundamentals of instruction, that's a big part of the commercial test that's different from the private test, but it's also a big thing for you as an instructor or you trying to teach a commercial pilot. You need to understand this. And as Don said, the book is horrible. It is one of the most poorly written books I've come across, and the FAA has several. I would rewrite them. I would rewrite them if they would just let me rewrite them. But they haven't been really. I wrote a regulation for them once, and they told me it was too simple. So they're not inclined to like what I do. To point it at the screen?
No, we've unplugged this on the side. I don't know which one of these ones.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yay! Okay, so the fundamentals of instruction all come from the Aviation Instructor's Handbook. And about 10 years ago or so, they made it longer, but they didn't make it better. So it is not an easy book to read. The key to this, in my opinion, is there's actually a lot of really good information in here. It's just really hard to pull it out. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. How to get the information you need for the fundamentals of instruction out of this book. Because all the test questions come out of this book on the written test, the knowledge test, and all of the test material for the practical test for the check ride comes out of this book. So it's pretty important that you understand it. It's just not easy to do. So before I get into the book, these are my 2 keys in my own head, and I have an education background. I taught in public schools for 8 or 9 years, and then off and on between flying here and there before I became a full-time balloonist. So I actually have a degree in education. But these are my keys. Can you take the steps in a procedure and explain them to your student? For example, you just don't say, okay, I want you to land. You have to tell them exactly what you want them to do. Well, what do you want them to do? If you're trying to make if you were an airplane, you'd say a glide slope approach. You'd want them to make a steady descent rate for a while, which you can't do too often in a balloon, but out on the mesa sometimes you can. And that's what I like to start with the first couple of times. Well, you need to tell them about the rhythm to keep their balloon in a steady descent. Well, you don't want them to do this all the way into the ground, so then you need to tell them how to get ready before they get to the ground. So what are they going to do? They're going to take the slack out of their red line, so when they pull it, it actually does something. You're going to lean against the basket, however your preference is. Mine is sideways or with your one cheek even slightly backwards, because you can't hold on when you're the pilot. The passengers can hold on, and you're less likely to fall out. So that's my personal preference. So I show them. I demonstrate it. I want you to do this. Get the slack out of your red line. Do this. Get braced against the edge of the balloon. Give a longer burn to flare out and get level with the ground. And always, 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 always vent before you touch the ground. Otherwise, you're going to bounce. So there's specific steps, and you need to be able to explain those to them. And so you have to be able to break down everything you do. What you're going to tell them in a steep descent is going to be quite different. But you need to be able to break down the maneuvers. And I've had people that came in, when I worked for World Balloon, like Don said, we did rides, we did flight instruction, we also did a bunch of corporate stuff. And so sometimes we'd hire people as corporate pilots, but in the off season, when they weren't flying rides or corporate stuff, they had to do flight instruction. When I said that, can you break this down? They had no idea what I was talking about. What do you mean break it down? You come down and you land. And we talked about this stuff sometimes for months before they figured out what I was talking about, how to break down each. And we talked about every single procedure we did in detail for months before they finally figured out what I was saying and they could do it. So some people do it, like Don said, he picked it up fairly easily. Some people can do it easier than others, but pretty much anybody can do it if they have enough time to practice it. Everything takes practice. And then Dale was talking about how bad of a student I can be, because I can have a big delay from the time you tell me to do something. Fred just flew with me, he knows that. I was a student, and he was giving me a lesson, and he's going, why aren't you burning? Well, because students will go, which side was I on, and how long of a burn did he say to give? And they're thinking about it. So our aircraft, by its very nature, has a delay in it, and the students have a delay, some longer than others, and at some times longer than others. You got to be thinking way, way ahead. So those are my two keys, absolutes for teaching someone to fly. Don already went over the pre-solo requirements. You need to make sure that all those are covered and they're in their logbook and you have it documented somewhere. And make sure you are paying attention to the stuff that says it's flight training. And you have to sign them off to solo in one specific make and model. He's talking about similar balloons, that's before you sign them off. Whatever balloon they're signed off in has to be, that's the only one they can solo in, that make and model. The practical test standards, those are your guidelines. You need to be familiar with them a whole lot more than your students are, obviously, but then you'll know what the minimum requirements are in order to sign your students off, and that's a minimum. Raise requirements are quite a bit more stringent and more exacting than the PTS is. Those are the minimums. Got to be careful about minimums, because what happens frequently is that after someone gets their private pilot certificate, they go, oh, cut them, that's over, and they quit working at it, and they actually get worse. And after the minimum to begin with, and they get worse, that's kind of scary in my head. Okay, checklists. There's lots of ways to do a checklist. So I had one student that had way too much time on his hands. He made about 6 of these. He had a little flip thing, so as he finished one, he'd flip the page. And then we'd talk about something else, and he'd say, oh, I need to put that in my checklist. And so he'd make another one. And so he gave me one of the old ones, and that worked really well for him. I have these on lanyards, not around my neck, but hanging from the tanks in the balloon, so that the checklists that are required by the PTS are in the balloon. This one's slightly different. I had one guy that said, this doesn't work for me. I need to actually check it off. One guy did it on his phone. One guy did it on a clipboard. It's whatever works for you, but they're required. And every other part of aviation uses checklists. It's been really hard to get balloonists to do it because we came in the back door. We didn't start out as part of aviation like everybody else did. Okay, the fundamentals of instruction. These are the parts of the PTS. These are also the chapters in this book, Aviation Instructor's Handbook. The first 2 are out of order, but the exact same wording. They're exactly the same things. So, if you are going to look at this book, here's the chapters. Human behavior is first. Chapter 2 is the learning process. They skip a couple of chapters here and there. They skip 3. They skip 8. But most of the chapters that are in here, what you're going to be using as an instructor and your students are going to need to be able to use in order to pass the required tests. So here's where you can find all this stuff. And you should have handouts with all this on it so you know where to find these things. So the first thing is you need to gear your instruction toward that individual student. You can't do every student the same. You can't try and teach them all the same because they don't all learn the same. Some pick it up faster, some don't. Some need more repetition. Some have an aviation background and they've got some understanding of some of the concepts already. Some have no clue at all. And some learn better by listening. Some learn better by reading. You've got to be able to adapt. Now, you also have to remember that you can't work with everybody. If there's somebody you can't work with, quit doing it. Get someone else to do it. I have the luxury of having several other instructors, so on rare occasions when I go, I am going to shoot this guy, if I have to get in the basket with him again, I can give him to somebody whose tolerances are different. I did. I had one guy that was so obnoxiously arrogant that I just wanted to slap the guy. At one point he said, why do I have to pack up the balloon? Can't I get some unemployed Mexicans to do this? Yeah. And my comment was, before I went, I cannot fly with this guy ever again, was, well, when you leave here, you're not going to have experienced crew like we do now, and if you haven't done it, how are you going to teach your crew how to do it? And then I went to Tom Reyes. I don't know if anybody knew him. He passed away quite some time ago, but Tom was an unemployed Mexican, 6'5", not an intimidating guy, and he thought it was funny. And so every time this guy said something that was just obnoxious, Tom would just laugh at him. And the first thing he said when he walked in was, you want an unemployed Mexican? Here I am. Okay, so you can't work with everybody. I couldn't work with that guy. Motivation. You need to know why your students are there. Why do they want to get their private or commercial certificate? Especially with commercial, there's a huge range of motivations, and part of that is what they want to do afterwards. Do they want to give instruction? Do they want to eventually fly rides? Do they want to do corporate stuff? And you can gear some of your training toward their interests. It also helps if you know what motivates them, to keep them motivated in the slumps, because there will be some. Anxiety. That is one of the things that will completely stall their training. They will not make any progress if they're scared. And there's certain places where everybody's scared. The check rides. I've given check rides to FAA inspectors that have had 7, 8, 9, sometimes 10 different check rides. They're still nervous. Everybody is. If they know everybody's nervous, it helps. The other time is when we're practicing emergency procedures. Everybody gets nervous then. And if they know that it's common and they're just not some kind of a freak, sometimes that helps. But you got to get them past that anxiety, because one of the things it says in this book, yes, it's a really difficult book to understand. It says, stress and anxiety will narrow their perceptual field. What the heck does that mean? Well, what it means is that if they're stressed, if they're scared, like when I was learning to fly, I was afraid of the ground. And every time the ground got close, I was looking at the ground. Wasn't looking at the fences over here, or the cows, or I was focusing on that one thing. And they can't do that. They need to get beyond that, or they don't get better. So anxiety, dealing with anxiety is a big thing. Now, every once in a while, you get somebody that's abnormal, and we'll get to that later. The principles of learning. I don't care if someone knows these terms or not. If they say readiness, effect, primacy, intensity, and recency, I say, what does that mean? And if they can't remember, they go, I can't remember what it's called, but it's this. I'm happy with that. I don't care if they memorize these terms. Readiness. Are they ready to fly? Because I had one woman whose father had just died. She was not ready. Sometimes they're not physically ready. I had a woman come in with a broken hip, and she walked with a cane, and she could not make a circle around the balloon because her hip was still in too bad a shape. But she said, I have a third-class medical. I said, do this. I can do this. And so we had to take her out and show her why it wasn't going to work. So readiness is important. It may just be that they really have to pee. Are they going to be able to concentrate then? No, they're not ready. Effect. Are they having fun? You don't want to smash them into the ground on their first flight, and don't teach emergency procedures because they're stressful. You want them to have some fun or they're not going to continue. I know somebody who did that. Second lesson, he was teaching emergency procedures. He decided he was going to teach all of his crew to fly. 2 of them quit. He did emergency procedures the second day, scared them to death. They said, never mind, I don't want to do this. They have to be having a good time. Are they going to have a good time every single flight? No, but they better start out that way or they're not coming back. Primacy, what you learn first is what you remember. Make sure they learn the procedures correctly the first time. Don't let them continue to do something like if they aren't braced or if they're standing like this and starting to fall out of the basket every time, don't let them do that. Make sure that they learn it right the first time. It's very difficult to unlearn something. Intensity. You can't learn to fly a balloon by reading books about flying balloons. And I've had people that think that. They've come in and they go, they can tell me anything I ask, and they understand every part of it. But does that mean they can fly a balloon? No, they can't, and they're always so surprised that they aren't perfect immediately. Recency. This is one of the advantages of a school like mine. We fly every flyable day for normally 3.5 weeks. This year it's been closer to 4 to 5. Every flyable day, so they get the consistency, so they don't forget what they learned by the time they come back to the next one. So people that have their training spread out over 2-3 years have a lot more hours because they're constantly relearning things. Then this is another really important concept, the levels of learning. And sometimes you have to start out with rote. You're just memorizing stuff. What's this dash blue circle around this airport mean? Oh, that's Class D airspace. Okay, fine, then memorize that. Understanding is that if you can point to this airport and this airport and this airport, and they look slightly different, Double Eagle has a keyhole, most of them don't have Class D keyholes. They have E extensions for their keyholes. If they can look at it, and some of them are really this big and some of them are like this, if they can look at any of them and they say, okay, that's Class D, and they know what the requirements are for flying in them, then they understand it. Applying it is when you get out on the mesa and you're heading toward Double Eagle Airport and they go, oh, we're getting into Double Eagle's airspace. I need to call them on the radio, and they know what to say to them, and they know that's one of the requirements is communication. That's the application. The correlation is, can they use those skills no matter where they are? So for example, if you're teaching them to fly level, that's a pretty basic skill. Can they use that skill then to stay in a level, in a layer of air that's 100 feet thick, and if they go up and down 100 feet, they're not going to get where they want to go? That's correlation. Okay, building blocks. This is an important concept too, and one that the guy who was teaching emergency procedures immediately was not following. It's a more advanced skill. It's not part of the building blocks. You start out with level flight and more shallow, slower descents, and hopefully not landing in the wind at first. Very few students can do their first landing, even if you demonstrated landing. If it's a windy one, they're not usually doing that the first time. That's a more advanced skill. That's on the next, so flying level is a very basic building block. You're not going to teach steep descents and emergency procedures until they have the basics. Can they fly level? Can they make a normal descent and landing? Can they land basically where they want to? That's building blocks. And you also use that in planning your instruction and in the teaching process. A lot of these chapters overlap. So sometimes people will say, oh, I'll say, well, what is this? And they'll tell me, and they'll go, oh, wait, no, that's part of the teaching process. They overlap. Checklists, again, they're required to be used. One way or another, they need to be using checklists. It's not only a requirement, it's a safety thing. Because even experienced people, if it's not a normal day, if too many things are going wrong, you're going to forget something. if you look at your checklist, slow down, take a breath, and look at your checklist, you go, oh, I didn't tie off my balloon yet, or whatever it is. Plateaus. This is an important concept. Almost everybody will plateau at some time during their training. If they don't plateau during training, they plateau afterwards, but almost everybody's going to plateau, meaning they kind of hit a brick wall at some point and they don't get any better. And what I've found is not only not get better, they get worse. And that's very, very frustrating, one of those anxiety things you have to deal with. If they know that that's normal, everybody plateaus, hopefully not the day before their check ride, which has happened. If they know that everybody plateaus, they don't feel quite as bad. There's a whole section on forgetting and retention, things you can do to make sure that your students don't forget, like practicing. And if you aren't flying frequently, make them review stuff in the books that they need for their flights. Make them go over the flight manual. You don't want them to forget stuff in between your flights. Practicing is one of those ways that you can help them remember things. Mnemonics. In aviation, there's tons of mnemonics, but we even have sayings like, when in doubt, rip out. East is least and west is best for magnetic variation, whether you add or subtract. That doesn't work quite as well for us, but that's one of them. Arrow is something that airplanes use. There's a lot of mnemonics. Say, I'm safe is another one. So those will help your students remember things. Habits. A lot of things they have to develop into a habit because if they have to think about them all the time, they can't progress to something else. So yes, they're going to be using a checklist, but their pre-flight preparation should become a habit. They do it the same way every single time, and they don't have to think about it too much, except to double check and make sure they didn't do everything, or else they're going to miss something else. If they have to constantly be thinking about their rhythm in order to fly level, they can't learn any of the more advanced things. So those things have to become automatic. They have to become habits. So what are we going to use in teaching flying? It isn't so much in the ground school, but in teaching the flying, you're going to use the demonstration performance method. I actually talked about that a little bit already. You're going to first explain it to them. And you can do that in ground school ahead of time. You can reiterate it again when you get out there. And then you need to show them. You need to show them what you want them to do. Then they do it. And then you, of course, are watching what they're doing, and you critique it afterwards. We're going to talk in detail about critiques also, but it needs to be right afterwards. And you may have to do that whole thing numerous times for certain procedures. You know, sometimes I demonstrate the rhythm for flying level once, and they've got it. Sometimes I've done it 7 or 8 or 9 times before they get the idea on what I'm talking about with the rhythm and using the horizon and that sort of thing. Building blocks we already talked about. We already talked about the practical test standards. Then it's got a whole section on curriculums, a syllabus, and a curriculum and a syllabus aren't exactly the same, and a lesson prep. So lesson plans, anybody who's a teacher knows this. I was surprised when I kept on getting applicants that didn't know, because, I mean, it was just like second nature to me. I've been writing lesson plans for years. They are written. By definition, a lesson plan is in writing. And I had somebody say to me once, well, you want me to write lesson plans, but you don't have one. Yes, I do. It's in my back pocket. Now, do I take my entire lesson plan with me all the time? I wrote them. And I've looked them over several hundred times. And so I don't take the entire lesson plan with me anymore. I take basically a checklist, but it's in writing. And I've got it with me every time I fly. And people don't always see it because I pull it out of my back pocket, look at it, and I put it back in. But they have to be in writing. And especially if you're new, you're going to need the whole thing. So they have an entire section on preparing lessons. And the lessons that are in this book obviously are made for airplanes, but they do have a few. And you can adapt them, but you can also use this. The BFA Instructor Handbook or Manual has every lesson plan in it, Plus, it has a pre-solo written test if you don't want to make your own. Plus, it has a checklist similar to what Don was showing you, one of the fold-out ones. It has a checklist in the back similar to that. So it's quite a bit out of date, but most of it is still pertinent. The only thing it doesn't say, and it also has endorsements. The endorsements are in the back of here. The endorsement almost everybody leaves out that they need to have is 6139 has to be referenced when you sign somebody off. There's a bunch of endorsements that don't have that. My pilot log, I've got a BFA pilot log. That one does. This does. This does not. So this has endorsements in the back, but it's missing 6139, and FAA is getting picky about it now. We weren't pushing it so much, but our last DPE meeting, they said we had to. Yes? 6139 is the requirements that you have to make sure are done before you can sign someone off for their check ride. And it's got a list of stuff. I'm not going to go through the whole list because you can look it up. 6139, be familiar with it. But make sure that whatever reference you're using has that in there. There's also one other minor problem with this one. They referenced something for airplanes instead of balloons in one point, but this does have the sign-offs, and they're still valid. This does say you have to go to 3,000 feet for a private and 5,000 feet for a commercial, and you haven't had to do that for years and years and years. Since whenever those PTSs came out, 1997 was the last time you had to go to 5,000 feet. Anyway, so this is somewhat out of date in that regard, but everything's right here. You don't have to recreate the wheel. Okay, critiques. Critiques are critical. A critique is done immediately, either after the end of the flight. I like to do it while we're flying, right after the maneuver. So let's say they were supposed to be making a steady rate descent and round out and vent and stop it, somewhere around this road. And instead, they came down, and as they got closer to the ground, their rate of descent increased, and they burned and burned and burned, and they went, and they missed it altogether. Right after that, you tell them what they did right. Well, they started out with a nice rhythm, and then they started getting distracted by something and lost the rhythm and let it get ahead of them. And if they had just vented when the balloon started to go back up, instead of just letting it go back up, they still could have landed there. So they know what they did right, what they didn't do right, and what they need to do about it instead. Vent. If you're starting to go back up, vent then. And you have to vent harder if you've already overburned. So critique has all three of those things. It needs to be relatively immediate. So at least by the end of the flight, my preference is by the end of the maneuver, what they did right. Because even as badly as they might have done something, they did something right. You're still alive. What they didn't do right and how they need to improve. Exactly what do they need to do? Well, the other thing they could have done was not let them get distracted and keep their rhythm the same instead of forgetting about the rhythm. Sometimes they start talking. Students at first, I found, cannot even listen and fly very well. They absolutely cannot talk and fly. So particularly people that have been around balloons for a while and, they've been with other pilots and the pilots talk while they're flying, they want to talk and they fly like yo-yos. It's hard to get them to quit talking because they can't talk and fly until much later. Hopefully they can by their check ride because they have to. So that's a critique. So a critique is just one type of evaluation. You can have an oral evaluation. You can ask them lots of questions. The pre-solo test, which doesn't have to be written, by the way, but I suggest it as another cover your butt thing. So your pre-solo test is another type of evaluation. The FAA knowledge test is another type of evaluation. The practical test, the check right at the end, is an evaluation. There's a lot of different evaluations, but a critique is a very specific, immediate type of evaluation. So they've got an entire section on assessments and evaluations, and it'll tell you how to write a multiple choice test should you want to. And one of the things it says in there, which I find interesting, it says in this book, when you ask a question, it should focus on only one idea. There's not one item in here, there's one idea. One of the things we have to cover is instructor professionalism and characteristics, which is not their responsibilities and characteristics, which are two different things, but they put it all in one sentence. They do that all the time. So the FAA can't even follow their own book. It's pretty sad, actually. So one of the things you have to do for your check ride, and they have to practice this, because the first time they do it, even if they're teachers, even if they're CFIs, some people can instruct, but they can't instruct in a balloon because of all those delays, especially the balloon itself. So they need a written syllabus, written lesson plans, written documentation. Everything has to be written down. So they got a whole section on that. And see, when I was saying that never mind. Pages, it starts in chapter 1, it's in chapter 6. They overlap in a lot of places. The blocks of learning we already talked about. Those are in a couple of different places, but they emphasize it and give you some examples. And yes, they're for airplanes, but you can figure them out. They are in chapter 6. Scenarios is in chapter 6. Don was talking about scenario-based testing. Well, we're going to do that during the practical test too, because part of it requires us to say, these are the conditions, this is where you're going to take off from, plot this out, and they make you plot a course, even though we don't do that in ballooning, because they want to make sure that you know how to use a plot and that you understand all the airspace that you're flying through. What are the requirements? So we're going to use scenarios. And we use scenarios in flight training. We use scenarios in the flight part of the practical test. So the more you can come up with a whole idea, if anybody's taken either the commercial or the private ground schools through Quad A, the storybook at the end talks about everything you've gone over in 2.5 mind-numbing days. That's a scenario. And that's where you pull everything all together and make sure they really understand things. So scenarios are great. You're going to see more and more and more of them. This is a required part of the practical test standards. On a commercial check ride, this is one thing we have to cover. Instructor characteristics and responsibilities. And like I said, it's not the same thing. So a lot of times they don't even need to read a book. If you want to think about instructor characteristics, think about your instructor. Well, personally, one of my limitations is if they stink, I'm not hiring them. I don't care how good of an instructor they are. If they smell bad, that basket's too small to be in the basket for an hour or so with somebody that stinks. They're not working for me. And I've turned down one guy multiple times for that reason. He doesn't know that's why. He's also not a very good instructor. That's another reason, but that's a whole different thing. So I don't like people who yell. I don't like being yelled at. I like people who can explain things calmly. I don't like people that go, ah! They scare me. So those are things that I'm looking for in an instructor. And then some basic things. Do they know how to fly? Do they know how to instruct? Those are pretty basic. Everybody has their own criteria for what they find they want in an instructor. There was an instructor here several years ago who was ex-military, and he yelled at people all the time. And he wasn't going to work for me because I hate that. But if he had somebody that was ex-military, he worked with them just fine. I would have kicked him about the second time he did that. Don't yell at me. So everybody has their own characteristics that they think are important. You don't even have to read the book to figure those out. Responsibilities, we already know most of those too. You need to know how to endorse. We've got several places that you can find the endorsements. You need to know what the endorsements are and how they have to be recorded and where they have to be recorded. You need to know that you have to keep it for 3 years. You know, some of the things that Don talked about. You need to make sure they're ready before you sign them off to solo. You need to make sure that they're ready before you endorse them for their check ride. There's a whole list of responsibilities in there, but those are some of the basic ones. Did you teach them thoroughly enough that they really understand it and can use it, or did you just talk to them? Teaching is not telling. I mean, telling is not teaching. Just because you told them doesn't mean they have it. So you need to be able to evaluate also. That's one of your responsibilities, is to evaluate where in the process your students are. And don't let them pressure you. Sometimes you get people that are very pushy, very cocky. Don't let them push you into doing something that you don't think they're ready for, because sometimes they'll try. Most people won't, but some will. Length of the lessons. This is really an important thing also. I had an instructor once that the first 2 lessons, the woman that came back after flying was in tears. And he said, I'm looking at what they did and went, you flew with her for an hour and 45 minutes. That's too long. She can't concentrate that long. Well, she kept on getting worse and worse. I had to keep on going. Like, no, you need to quit. They can't concentrate that long. The first lesson is usually less than an hour for me. Less than an hour. So as they get more and more proficient and things are coming easier, you can extend those lessons. Sometimes toward the end we have hour and a half, hour and 40-minute lessons. That's fine, but not at the beginning. And when he did it again, that was the last time he flew for us. It's like, see ya. And I put her with a different instructor. She was ready to go home. I put her with a different instructor, said, I'm not even going to charge you for these first 3 lessons because all I did was frustrate you. I'll give you a different instructor. And she did great because his first 3 lessons were 45 minutes. Well, she could concentrate that long. And he was a little more tuned in to people in general, but definitely women are different. You teach women differently from men. That's another thing you need to know. And he was more tuned in to what a woman needs from instruction than a guy does. And he recognized when she was getting tired. And he quit. Physical distress is a problem too. Like if they have a migraine or something, they can't concentrate. As I said, if they really need to pee, you might just need to quit because they can't concentrate. If they're standing like this, that's all they're paying attention to is trying not to wet their pants. Whatever it is. Maybe they're freezing. Their fingers are numb. Their toes are numb because they weren't prepared. Oh, Albuquerque, we're down near Mexico. It should be warm. Yeah. They might not be prepared for the weather. Whatever it is, you need to be aware of those things and know when to quit. So we already talked about the practical test standards. You guys have this as a handout, by the way. And you'll notice that one of the things on there is the book that Don was talking about, Telling is Not Teaching. So if you're having a lot of trouble with this book, you can get that book, and some of it is a little more clear. He also has done 2 webinars on it. 2 so far, right? Yeah. There's another portion to it. Barbara.
That handout is after my
Oh, okay. So it's not after my presentation, but it's in the handout somewhere. So your regulations are definitely one of the things you should be using and you're familiar with. The practical test standards, not only do you need to use these as a guideline, but you need to go over these with your students before the check ride. Because once in a while, one of the questions on my checklist when I start an oral is, and you're familiar with the practical test standards? And if they go, huh? That's usually the end of it. We don't even start it. Because I've had one person ever pass the oral that wasn't familiar with the practical test standards, and it was because his father had been a pilot and his grandfather had been a pilot, and he was around ballooning forever, and he picked up that stuff without this book. But that's not typical. And I got a couple other things here that if I ask them a question, I can ask 2 questions and tell if they read this thoroughly or not. And I do them pretty early on. It's like, okay, they skimmed it. That's not a good sign. They need to be very, very familiar with this. Does that mean they're not going to pass? No, not necessarily. But it means it's going to kill me because it's going to be a 3-hour oral. It's going to kill them too. But it's as hard on me as it is on them, trying to get them to answer questions when they're giving me blank looks. Like, oh, man. So it's not just hard on the applicant, it's hard on the examiners also. The Flight Instructor Manual is one of them. This book is actually pretty good. I don't know if anybody's ever looked at the previous 2 versions. They were pretty bad, both of them. This one's not perfect. It's got a couple of errors in it here and there. And it's got a few things I totally disagree with. And if you look at the tether, the trucks are backwards. But for the most part, this is pretty good. And so at the very least, this can either be an introduction or it can be a review. It can be a summary. It's a pretty well done book. Sectionals, have them look at a bunch of different ones. I once had somebody fail because he's from this area. And I showed him a Chicago sectional, and he couldn't figure out any of the airspace because the background was green, not brown. He couldn't figure out what anything was. Even when I pulled out a Denver sectional and said, here, look at this. Do these look the same? He said, no. Okay. So they got to look at a lot of different ones. And then for the application, they can either do IACRA, which is what the FAA prefers, is that you use their online system. Not super user-friendly. It takes some practice. If you have questions, you can call me. Sometimes you have to call the tech people in order to get it figured out. Sometimes what the tech people tell you is start all over and do another one. So it's not infallible, but it's a lot less paperwork. They have fewer mistakes when somebody's done it through IACRA. It doesn't mean you don't have to review everything, but that's their preference. If you don't do that, at least go to the FAA website, fill out the application they have on their website because they keep on updating them and changing them and they won't accept the previous version. So go to the website, fill out the application because you can type everything in, print it out and sign it, and then we don't have to worry about whether you can read it or not either. Any questions? Yes?
What do you think about that FAA?
This one? Thank you.